Good evening, guys. Back for another video for our second topic. And let me apologize for the way I probably look. I've been sick for 2 weeks with, I guess, the flu or something else. I don't know. And it's been rough. So I probably look worse than usual, if that's possible. What do you think of the t-shirt? I picked up a bunch of these Universal horror film related shirts for my class, which I've been taking on the Universal horror films, and I missed one for being sick. And that was the night we talked about The Mummy. But I've seen, let's see, the first class we had Dracula, second class Frankenstein, and last Wednesday I went back. I probably should have stayed home, but I went and we saw the Invisible Man. So anyway, that class is going well, really enjoying it. So the topic this week, James would like us to talk about our favorite era or decade of horror films, time period, and then give a list of our top 10 favorites, which is always fun. So, anyway, as far as the time period, as much as I do love the period of the 1930s going into the 1940s, and will always treasure those films and that entire atmosphere. That's where it all started for me, really. But I would have to say that as far as output and quality, I think the 1960s, and specifically the first half of that decade, is probably the best time for me. In that decade, we still had all the classic horror stars still with us, except for Mr. Lugosi, unfortunately. But we had Boris Karloff working, we had Lon Chaney, we had Basil Rathbone, Peter Lorre, Christopher Lee was young and healthy, Peter Cushing, and of course Barbara Steele from Italy. So we had from the Italian Gothic horror film genre had started in 1960 and extended for most of that decade. Had some really quality films that came out from that. In England, we had the Hammer films, which to me were at their peak in the early 1960s. I think they went off the rails a little bit when they got up into the 70s. And then, of course, in America, we had the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe series at American International Pictures, which I appreciate more and more every time I see these films. The House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death. Recently, I picked up a Blu-ray of Tomb of Ligeia, which was the last in the Corman, Vincent Price, Poe series, and I have a much larger appreciation for the film. I still think it's very flawed, but I like it much more than I used to. So anyway, I would say that's my favorite era. Plus the fact that I was so young, and I was discovering not just the old movies on TV, but I was surrounded by movie posters. Didn't get to see all the movies, but I could see the posters when I went to town, and I could see the posters in the newspapers advertising all these cool horror movies, and reading the monster magazines, and it was just a great time, and I will always remember that. Okay, so getting to my top 10 list, except for the top 2 or 3, these aren't in any particular order, but to sort of start off with something that is not terribly well known. This is a film that I'd like to promote to everybody until you get sick of hearing me talk about it. This is an English film from 2017 or 2018, one of the two, called Ghost Stories, which is based on a play, strangely enough. And I can't recommend it highly enough. I like this a lot. It's all about a man who his career is exposing paranormal events to be fake. And he is challenged by someone to take this series of events that may be actually real and to find out if they are true or not. And it leads him into a very dark place. And what's amazing about this film is that it has incredible imagery. It's very frightening, but it has no violence, which for me is a big plus for a film that's fairly recent. Don't get this confused with this marvelous film, A Ghost Story, which may look like it's a horror movie, but it's not. But this is also highly recommended for much different reasons. Okay, so And then on the list, I would put the original Dracula and the original Frankenstein as being eternal favorites. I love both of the films. They're very different. I think that Frankenstein, as far as quality, is the superior film for its cinematography, the direction, everything about it. It moves so quickly. It's exciting every minute. Plus, Karloff will just break your heart. But Dracula, of course, James Whale was the director of Frankenstein, and he is a very talented director with a lot of just a lot of imagination. Todd Browning, on the other hand, who directed Dracula, is I think he was still stuck in the silent era, and in a way, it made Dracula work, but it worked in an entirely different way because it's a very quiet, very stagey film. And I think that the first part of the film, where we meet Dracula in his castle, and on up to the point where the ship lands in England, and I think that's where, to me, the film could stop there, and it would be a perfect film. I certainly want to see more of Lugosi and Dwight Frye throughout the rest of the movie, but it does get kind of slow and a little bit stagey. But I still love it. I still appreciate it. Always will. Next up, I would say House on Haunted Hill, which Bob also mentioned in his video, and I've always loved this movie. Vincent Price is a great gimmick movie, but it's also another film that relies on atmosphere, and there's certainly a lot of jump scares, but it just creates this atmosphere of decay and dread in this house. It's just wonderful. Plus a great cast of actors. And next up is The Uninvited from 1944, classic ghost story from Paramount Pictures, where we actually get to see the ghost, but not until well into the film. And it builds up very slowly. It starts off in a very lighthearted way. And I think that works because by the time we get to the horror part of it, it's very jarring. You're just not expecting it. And the horror first appears to us not as screaming and noise and all kinds of jump scares, but as a woman crying. Okay? It's a very different kind of film. Beautiful music. The music is part of the plot, and it just works beautifully. Plus, Gail Russell is just phenomenal. And all right, next up is Black Sabbath from 1964. I believe it was actually filmed in 1963, but released in this country in '64. I could be wrong. Directed by Mario Bava. This was kind of his horror follow-up to Black Sunday, but this was done in color. It was an anthology, 3 stories. Boris Karloff narrated and starred in one of the films, which was about vampires. Unbelievable atmosphere in all 3 of these stories, especially in the story about the vampires. And one of the stories, which is more contemporary, is called The Telephone, about a young woman who appears to be a prostitute who is haunted by these threatening phone calls. It's interesting that in the Italian version, the original Italian version, there is an element in the plot involving lesbianism, or the suggestion of lesbianism, which is taken out of the American version. I guess they just felt that it should be censored. And when they did that, they made the story different in that in the original Italian version, there was nothing supernatural going on. In the American version, because they changed it, it added a supernatural element. So you could argue which one is more effective. I think they both are. Anyway, getting up to the next, The Haunting, which was mentioned by both Bob and James. Great ghost story, absolute classic. Next up is The Pit and the Pendulum, which is the second in the Edgar Allan Poe series. Vincent Price and Barbara Steele in a much smaller role than she had in Black Sunday, but very effective, very effective. And next up is The Innocents with Deborah Kerr, which is gorgeous black and white cinematography, which based on the short novel by Henry James called The Turn of the Screw, which is creepy enough, but they bring it to the screen. It's just very psychosexual weirdness, which when I was a kid in 1961, I went to see this. I had no idea what that was all about, but I just knew there was something very sick about what was being done in this film. It's very creepy and disturbing. But yeah, and of course on number one, it's probably always going to be Black Sunday from Mario Bava. It was not Barbara Steele's first film, but it was the film that made her a star overnight, and um, just loaded with atmosphere, loaded with suggestive eroticism without being real sexual. But even for its time, it was considered to be a little bit graphic and violence and all that sort of thing. But I think it endures even today, even in its badly dubbed versions. And even though there's a little bit of comedy relief that could be left out, quite frankly. But yeah, it's the one that this film and the Pit and the Pendulum, which came out a year later, and when it was released in Italy, was a huge hit because Black Sunday was only a moderate hit in Italy. But the combination of those two films made Barbara Steele a bona fide star, and she was the face of the Italian Gothic horror movement forever. Even after she no longer was making those films, she was the standard by which the other female characters were conceived. At least I think so. So anyway, let me do a couple of quick mentions here. This is a film that I didn't know about until fairly recently. Mill of the Stone Women. Has anyone seen this? I highly recommend this movie. This came out in 1960, about the same time as Black Sunday, another Italian film which is in color, and it is visually amazing, and I would highly recommend this. James mentioned Pumpkinhead, and I picked this up recently at the, well, I had this massive haul from Hamilton Book, and this is one of them. I have never had a copy of this film, but I've seen it on television, and it is one of the best horror films I ever saw. So I'm very happy to have this. He also mentioned Psycho. Bob talked about Psycho as well, and I recently picked this up from the Hamilton Book haul. It's the 2-disc DVD, forget 4K, who needs it, edition of Psycho. So very happy to have this. Looking forward to getting into it. And I guess that's my video for this time. I'm looking forward to what everybody else is doing. So take care, folks, and I will talk to you soon.